All right, diving right in. Let's talk tariffs, specifically Trump's newest pronouncements and how they might blow back on Canada and China.
Sounds explosive.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
We're looking at an Al Jazeera piece from November 26, just a couple days ago.
Uh,
The title's pretty blunt. Trump promises 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, extra 10% tariff on China.
Catchy.
Not in a good way, though, right?
Mhm.
25% on everything those countries send us. Plus, China gets hit with another 10% on top of what's already there.
Yeah, that's not just tweaking things around the edges. This is going after the U.S.'s biggest trading partners.
Yeah.
Huge implications for anyone following global economics, obviously.
It's like if global trade was a chessboard, Trump just flipped the table over.
The article lays out his reasoning wants to curb undocumented immigration and fentanyl coming in, but the language he uses...
Invasion and stuff like that, right?
Exactly. That rhetoric makes you wonder, is this really about policy or is it strong-arming to get a better deal? This isn't even the first time he's pulled this kind of thing. Back on the campaign trail, he was hinting at tariffs even higher than this.
And markets are reacting like they've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well.
For sure. The peso's dropping, the euro, even the British pound's taking a hit against the dollar. Everyone's heading for the safe bet.
Okay, but what does that mean for regular people, not just these investors we always hear about?
Think of it like this. Those currency shifts, they have consequences. Suddenly, stuff American companies need to import gets pricier.
So it hits our wallets too, eventually.
Likely, yeah. That new phone you want, that electric car, prices could go up. Or the company eats the cost, but then maybe they got to cut jobs, innovation slows down, who knows?
It's all connected, huh? Speaking of connections, let's zoom in on Canada. They do a lot of business with the U.S. The article points out they buy more from us than China, Japan, France, and the UK all put together.
Oh.
Definitely puts them in a tough spot. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, she's been emphasizing how closely the two countries work together, especially on border security.
Like, hey, we're already on top of this stuff kind of message. Exactly. She even addressed fentanyl specifically, pointed out both U.S. and Canadian authorities are working daily to stop trafficking coming from China and elsewhere. Tariffs aren't the answer if we're already collaborating. That's the vibe I get.
But it can't all be sunshine and roses from their side, right? This has got to be worrying for them economically.
Oh, absolutely. Ontario's premier, Doug Ford, he called these tariffs potentially devastating. Jobs on both sides of the border would be on the line. And even the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, their big news outlet, they're calling this Trump's most serious threat against Canada in years.
Wow. So they're trying to be diplomatic, but also making it clear this could be really bad. All right, what about China? They're kind of used to being in Trump's trade war crosshairs.
Their response so far is more low-key. Their embassy in Washington put out a statement basically saying no one wins a trade war, which a lot of economists would agree with.
Sounds like they're trying to cool things down, at least with words.
Yeah. Their spokesperson even stressed how the U.S.-China economic relationship benefits both sides. That's a direct counter to Trump's whole zero-sum game thing.
Okay, so we've got this tense situation brewing. Trump's wielding tariffs, markets are freaking out, Canada's trying to play peacemaker, and China's urging calm. But this feels like just the beginning, right? What happens next is the real question.
That's where it gets interesting. To understand what these tariffs could actually do, we got to go deeper than just these initial reactions. We got to look at how this stuff works.
All right, let's do it. Economics isn't exactly my strong suit, but I'm ready to learn. So what should our listeners be thinking about as this whole thing plays out?
First thing to remember, tariffs aren't just some abstract concept. They have very real consequences for businesses, for everyday consumers, and for the entire global economy. We're not talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about people's lives.
Right, and you mentioned earlier tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods. Can you break that down a bit more for our listeners? What does that actually mean for them? Especially for someone interested in, let's say, the tech industry.
Absolutely. That's a great place to start. So with the tech industry, right, a lot of the parts for your phone, your laptop, even electric cars, a lot of that stuff comes from China.
Makes sense.
So when these tariffs hit, those parts suddenly get a lot more expensive for American companies to bring in.
So there's like this ripple effect.
Yeah.
Those extra costs have to go somewhere.
Exactly. And a lot of times, it's the consumer who ends up paying more. That new phone, that electric car, the price tag goes up.
Makes sense. Or maybe the company tries to absorb the cost, but then has to cut corners elsewhere, maybe jobs or research and development, right?
Could be. It's not a simple equation. And it's not just tech either. This could affect everything. You know, we hear some folks, a lot of Trump supporters, saying these tariffs are good for the U.S. economy.
Yeah, bring back manufacturing jobs, give America more power in trade deals, that whole thing.
Right. And it's important to understand where they're coming from. But the reality is, it's a lot more complicated. Take that idea of bringing back manufacturing jobs.
Yeah. Is that really going to happen?
Tariffs might make it a little more appealing for companies to move production back to the U.S., but it's not a guarantee. There are other factors involved, too. Labor costs. You got to find skilled workers. The whole supply chain has to be reworked.
Right. It's not as simple as tariffs equal jobs.
Exactly. And even if some manufacturing does come back, it might not make up for the jobs lost in other areas that depend on those imports that are now more expensive.
Okay, so it's a trade-off in every sense of the word. What about that other argument that tariffs give the U.S. more leverage? Does that hold any water?
There's definitely a power dynamic there. The U.S. is a huge E&G market, and when you start slapping tariffs on imports, other countries notice they don't want to lose access to that market, so they're more willing to negotiate, make deals that are good for the U.S.
So it's like a high-stakes poker game, and Trump's just upped the ante.
Yeah, you could see it that way, but the other players might call his bluff. That's the risk. We've seen it before. Tariffs can lead to retaliation. China, Mexico, Canada, they could all hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
And then everyone loses. Right, that's the whole trade war scenario, which China already said no one wins.
Right, they did say that. And in the long run, yeah, trade wars hurt everyone involved. Think back to the 1930s, the Great Depression. The U.S. actually had a tariff, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It was supposed to help American farmers, but it ended up making things worse.
Really?
Yeah. It sparked a global trade war, deepened the Depression, and had ripple effects worldwide. Not a good precedent.
Wow. So it sounds like what's happening now could have some really serious consequences for the global economy, not just for the countries directly involved.
Absolutely. You know, for anyone following global trade and economics, this is crucial to understand. This isn't just a U.S. issue, it's global. Even if these tariffs don't lead to an all-out trade war, they still create uncertainty. And uncertainty makes businesses nervous to invest, consumers hold back on spending, and the whole economy slows down.
So we're talking potential damage to businesses, to consumers, even to the global economy as a whole. But there's another piece to this puzzle that we haven't touched on yet. Trade agreements, specifically the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA. That agreement governs a ton of trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
You're right, we can't forget about that. And this new agreement took years to hammer out.
And Trump's been pretty critical of NAFTA and USMCA in the past. Is it possible these tariffs are a way for him to force a renegotiation or even blow up the whole agreement?
I think it's definitely possible. If he thinks those agreements aren't working for the U.S., he might see tariffs as a way to strong-arm Canada and Mexico into making concessions. But unraveling something as complex as USMCA that could have all sorts of unintended consequences, it creates a ton of uncertainty for businesses that rely on that cross-border trade.
So much uncertainty. We've got this potential economic fallout, the threat of a trade war, existing trade agreements hanging in the balance. It's a pretty tense situation, but is there any hope here? Is there anything that could de-escalate things before they get out of hand?
Well, diplomatic channels are still open, right? Countries can talk, try to find some common ground. Remember, Freeland was emphasizing how strong the U.S.-Canada relationship is. There's always the possibility of negotiation and compromise.
That's true. But those negotiations are going to be tough. Everyone's got their own interest to protect. And then you've got those underlying issues that led to these tariffs in the first place. Immigration, drug trafficking, national security. Those are really complex problems with no easy solutions.
You hit the nail on the head. And that brings us to a really crucial question for our listener, something to really think about as this situation develops.
Yeah. It's like, do we keep going down this road of aggressive tariffs, risking economic blowback, hurting relationships with our closest trading partners? Or is there another way?
Right, like what's the alternative?
And that's what I'd love for our listeners to think about, especially those of you who follow global trade and economics closely. How should the U.S. be tackling these tough issues? Immigration, drugs, national security. Can we find solutions that don't involve basically starting a trade war? Solutions that actually bring countries together?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It feels like we need some serious outside-the-box thinking here. Maybe instead of just throwing up barriers like tariffs, we should be investing in things that actually strengthen our global ties.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, things like educational exchanges, more collaboration on technology, maybe even joint infrastructure projects, stuff that gets people working together across borders. I like that. Building those kinds of connections, it creates trust, understanding. That's got to be more effective than just trying to punish each other with the tariffs, right?
And it can't just be governments doing this stuff either. Businesses, nonprofits, even regular people.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in building a world where countries work together, not against each other.
It's true. And this whole situation, it really drives home just how connected we all are. Whatever happens with these tariffs, it's not just going to affect the US, Canada, and China. It's going to have ripple effects everywhere.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together, for better or worse.
Exactly. So for everyone listening, the takeaway here is simple. Stay informed, stay engaged, and ask those tough questions. The decisions being made right now, they're going to have huge consequences down the road. And your voice matters. Don't forget that.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's a complicated issue, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out. We'll be keeping a close eye on things, and we hope you will too. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those questions coming.